Okay, well, it's 3 o'clock, so I think we'll make a start. Thank you, everyone, for jumping on the webinar today. I just wanted to take a few minutes just to give you a quick overview of who's speaking on the call today and what the agenda is. So, joining us, we have myself. So, I'm Lewis Denton Burke. I'm a solutions consultant at Flow Communications. Christine Bejarasco, who's the Vice President of the Tactical Defence Unit at F-Secure, Simon Newman, who's the Head of Business Services at the Police CPI, Neil Sinclair, National Cyber Lead at the Police Digital Security Centre, and Anthony Idowu, who is the Lead Engineer at F-Secure. So the schedule for today is the history of ransomware, which will be presented by Christine. The most common threats seen today from Simon Newman. Sorry, I tell a lie. It's the history of ransomware and the most common threats seen today from Christine. Police statistics on cybercrime in the UK from Simon. The mind of a cyber criminal with Neil. And how to map your attack surface with Anthony. Finally, we'll have who should you call for support if you were to have a cyber breach. And then we'll be doing a Q&A session at the end. With regards to the Q&A, there'll be a text box at the bottom of your page. So we're doing all the questions at the end, but I appreciate something might pop into your head as we're going along. So please feel free just to type any questions that you think of as we go along, and I'll deal with them at the end of the call, pretty much. So that was it from me, pretty short and sweet, and I'll hand over to Christine. So Christine, if you'd like to share your screen, go ahead, that'd be fantastic.
So good afternoon. Do you guys manage to see my screen already?
Yep.
Okay, excellent. So as Lewis mentioned, I am Christine Bejarasco, and I lead the Tactical Defense Unit in F-Secure. So today, I'm going to take a look at how ransomware evolved through the years. Who were the ransomware threat actors targeting before, and who are they targeting today, as well as how their distribution mechanisms changed. Then I'll give some recommendations on how we can strengthen our organization's security standing against a potential ransomware attack, and at the same time, minimize the power that a ransomware threat actor can have over us. So if you have any questions, feel free to send those over. I'll try to address as much as I can after the presentation. So ransomware is not a recent phenomenon. Even before 2012, there were already different types of ransomware in existence. However, during 2012 to 2013, we have seen what we called police ransomware, where an exploit kit was being used as a distribution mechanism. So police ransomware meant that a legitimate website has been compromised, and the exploit kit was using a series of exploits in order to compromise the website visitor. And if one of those exploit kits work, then the screen will be locked, and the malware will pretend to be coming from the police and request for payment. Your webcam could automatically turn on, and this was before the time when we have those webcam covers. So you have your face on the screen, and then a notification from your own country's police telling you that, for instance, child pornography was found on your device, and you need to pay a fine. And you can even go to your local neighborhood kiosk to get UCash or PaySafe card credits to pay the fine. Now, during 2013, CryptoLocker was the first mainstream crypto ransomware that gained popularity. And it's also the first one to accept cryptocurrency for payment. But since browsers were slowly kicking out heavily exploited plugins, such as Flash Player or Silverlight, and these browsers were hardening themselves, the usage of exploit kits started to lose popularity. And therefore, the ransomware threat actors needed to find a more suitable replacement. During 2016 to 2017, they found one, And this was the time when the main payloads that were distributed via spammed emails shifted from banking Trojans to ransomware. Out of all the payloads being distributed via spam, ransomware took 40% of the share around that time. Then there was an exponential rise of the different ransomware families that were introduced every year since 2013 all the way to 2017. But the picture changed in the past 2 years. So backdoors, bots, and info stealers now have 70% of the share of email spam payload. And ransomware got a measly 10%. And it's even lesser than 10% today. Yet we still hear a lot of ransomware infections that are happening. And many organizations are still getting compromised. So where is the infection coming from? And if you can see here on this page, so in order to understand this, let's take a look at what are the top threats distributed via emails recently. So Emotet is one of the top, if not the most spread malware that we have seen recently. And it has an interesting history. It came out 5 years ago as a banking Trojan. And during that time, it was a typical form-grabbing banking Trojan. After a potential victim enters his login credentials in a banking site, Emotet will retrieve those credentials before they're handed over to the bank. And Emotet's most visible infection vector is spam. But of course, it can be distributed via any other method as well. And most of the spam are coming from or pretending to come from shipping companies, telecoms, or financial institutions. So this spam, for example, here is coming from Amazon and is an example of this. Typical Emotet attachments are PDFs, document files, and even archives with a downloader inside. And even the PDFs and documents will have scripts that will fetch the Emotet binary from a remote location. And after years of spamming Emotet and several updated versions later, Emotet acquired a huge number of infected machines globally. And so they updated to their 4th version. This time, Emotet updated its communications protocol in order to better track these infected machines. And at the time, put them into different clusters to be used in different campaigns. So this also means that they changed their business, quote unquote, model. So they removed the banking Trojan module and stopped being a banking Trojan because they probably realized that there is more money to be had using their botnet as a base for distributing other malware because they have become really big. And so they started to deliver other banking Trojans from other cyber criminal groups instead. And one notable malware that they deliver is TrickBot. Now, TrickBot is also a modular malware, and it can perform reconnaissance in the network and find high-value targets. And if devices with more valuable content than the previous infected machine is found, then the malware can move towards that target. And Emotet has the capability to perform reconnaissance within the network and send the information that it finds to a remote attacker, while that remote attacker, in turn, can use that information to trigger a lateral movement towards another machine in the network, or remotely install TrickBot on a target device. So this TrickBot Emotet combination was first seen to distribute the Ryuk ransomware in 2019. And now the picture is complete. Apparently, ransomware threat actors have realized that mass distribution of ransomware is not that effective as an extortion model. Most of the recipients of those emails were individuals, and individuals may not always pay. And if they pay, the ransomware threat actors cannot expect that the monetary value will be substantial. Also, When you don't know your targets, your ransom values can be very generic. But what is costly to an individual may be insignificant to an organization. And it appears that when organizations get compromised, they equate time to recovery with monetary loss. So there's a high chance for ransom payment. The Ryuk ransomware is one of those that exact the heftiest ransom payments, and they're still alive today. Another emotet distribution method is via the wireless network, which means that connecting to a network that already has an emotet infection, using credentials that are easy to brute force, could end up with an emotet malware installed as a service into that device. And these attackers, they are very opportunistic. So what happens when an organization does not pay the ransom? They may threaten to expose the data that they have acquired and scare their victims regarding potential GDPR fines. And different types of ransomware have exposed information that they have acquired from non-paying organizations. So for example, the Ragnar ransomware, they call their activities bug hunting and then shame the organizations that don't pay. And this tactic has been employed by different types of ransomware threat actors who got annoyed that their potential victims did not pay the ransom. Over the years, the cost of ransom payments have become higher and higher as the sizes of organizations that these ransomware threat actors become bigger and bigger. And after all, when you're dealing with an organization that has $1 billion market share, the justification in the cyber criminal's mind will be, what is a few million? We have now seen that ransomware has different methods for getting into an organization. And this may be a tough advice to take. But in case of a ransomware infection, make it your goal not to pay the ransom. An ounce of prevention is definitely better than £1 million in ransom payment. So instead, focus on improving your organization's security posture. Have security consultants assess the security of your organization and ensure that you implement the recommendations that they give. And plug the holes identified. Those should help minimize the attack surface of your organization. Then train your people. Teach them to be wary of different types of social engineering attacks. In emails, for instance, if they learn to be suspicious of file attachments and URLs, then they can be wary of certain emails even if they recognize the sender. And then they can validate, for instance, from the sender using another method, like asking via SMS or WhatsApp if that particular sender truly sent the email. An endpoint protection product, or EPP, can prevent both known threats and even unknown threats with known methodologies for being installed in your system. So don't diminish the capability of an EPP product to keep crimeware away from your systems. Otherwise, performing cleanup of different threats out there is too costly when you can just prevent a vast majority of them. And when you get to the point that there are attackers that are performing manual attacks and using very weak signals that can seem benign on their own, then a detection and response product or service can help spot a breach early. So this detection and response product or service can spot a series of weak signals and stitch them together. And while a single signal may not mean anything, a series of these signals could mean a breach. We cannot use EPP for this since EPP is preventive and every weak signal could be prone to false positives when detected. So in summary, use EPP to keep most of the threats out and then use EDR to monitor them in case they get in so that you can spot them early and kick them out. Ransomware strikes fear into the hearts of those who don't have backups or who may have had their backups deleted by the ransomware as well. And this is why having backups with revision control, and preferably those that gets disconnected from the main network, after the backup sessions have completed can give greater peace of mind to the organization. And if, after doing all of the above, you still get infected anyway, then not paying the ransom should still be your top priority. The ransomware threat continues to thrive today because impacted organizations continue to view ransom payment as a viable solution. Paying the threat actors feeds into the cycle that makes the ransomware threat more powerful and more brazen in increasing the ransom prices. Threats have always been opportunistic, and the ransomware threat actors are no different. So whenever there's an area that no longer works, they proceed to another area. But since extortion via ransomware continues to deliver very good value for their time spent, then why stop? I know this is easier said than done, but at the end of the day, these are criminals. There is no assurance whether we will get our files back anyway, or if they have even made backup copies of those files for sale to another entity, or for sale in the future. So should we really fund this endeavor, or just help break the cycle? Thank you for your time. I will now give the floor to the next presenter.
Thank you. Right, let me just load my presentation up. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. Lewis, can you just confirm?
Yep, I can see that, Simon. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Simon Newman, as it says on the screen, Head of Cyber and Business Services for an organisation called Police Crime Prevention Initiatives, not for profit, owned by the police. Within that, I look after the Police Digital Security Centre and also the National Business Crime Centre as well. So just a few slides, really, a little bit about the statistics that we've got so far that kind of indicate the nature and the scale of the problem here in the UK. So first up, really, I guess just an introductory slide. And I guess the point for me is, over really the last 10 years, cybercrime has clearly become one of the fastest growing types of crime in the UK. Now sits very firmly on the National Risk Register as what we call a tier 1 threat to national security. And it's right up there with things like pandemic flu. It has evolved significantly, as many of you will be aware, becoming increasingly sophisticated, affects individuals and businesses alike. We increasingly hear about major attacks or breaches pretty much every week. Travelex, Garmin, even the British Dentistry Association are just a handful of recent examples that we know about. And of course, many others remain unreported. But how big a problem really is cybercrime, and how does UK law enforcement respond to the threat that we face? The statistics on this slide make for worrying reading, clearly, but is it really as bad as this? And is the problem actually getting out of control, or is it something that we are already addressing pretty effectively? During the next few slides, I'll be focusing on some of the data that we've got, and it tells us very much about the nature of the scale of cybercrime in England and Wales. This is the stuff that we are confident presents a reasonably accurate picture. I'll also be looking at some of the challenges that law enforcement agencies, not just here in the UK, but elsewhere, face in terms of trying to bring offenders to justice, so the people who are committing ransomware and other forms of cybercrime around the world. So, first of all, most of you will be aware the UK doesn't have a dedicated Cybercrime Act, and we use the Computer Misuse Act as the primary piece of legislation for prosecuting offenders. It's this act that forms the basis of official statistics that we use. I'm not going to focus on whether the act in its current form is fit for purpose or not, but it is worth noting that several countries around the world have introduced specific cyber-related legislation, and others, of course, are expected to follow. Even our own government, you may be aware, has recently concluded a consultation on the regulation and manufacture of IoT devices, with the results expected in the autumn. And this follows a code of practice that was produced and published, I think, a couple of years ago now. So if we use the Computer Misuse Act as the basis for defining cybercrime, the UK's Office for National Statistics describe it as this: a crime in which a computer is the object of the crime, hacking, phishing, spamming, for example, or is used as a tool to commit an offence, child pornography, or even hate crimes. And within this definition, there are two, I guess, components which we use to categorize the number of offences that are committed. And we have what we call cyber-dependent crime, and those are crimes that can only be committed via a computer or other device, such as online shopping or auction scams, and then cyber-enabled crimes. And these are crimes that are crimes that we may have experienced many times before in the past, but their reach or their scale is increased as a result of technology. So things like harassment being a good example, and the cases we see of online bullying and trolling, etc. So this is where it gets quite meaty, and I should just add here that I'm not looking to scare anyone in terms of the statistics, but there's a key message that comes out of the statistics that I'm about to put on the screen here. These are the figures I'm putting here are from the latest crime survey for England and Wales. Apologies for people who are in Northern Ireland, Scotland or further afield, but from speaking to other organisations, I believe that it's probably not too different situation in other countries. These are for the period April 2019 to March 2020. They are generally believed to be an accurate indication of the level of crime that we face in the UK. Very different to what we call police recorded crime, which varies depending on how each police force prioritises cybercrime and other types of offences. So effectively, we go on this to tell us the nature of the problem that we face. So first of all, I'll start up with this big figure on the left-hand side, 10.2 million. That is the total number of incidents of crime across England and Wales for the past 12 months. 10.2 million includes everything, cybercrime, fraud, violent attacks, theft, etc., the whole lot. That's effectively the total picture of incidents across England and Wales. Let me start going down. 4.5 million offences. That represents the total number of incidents of fraud and cybercrime across England and Wales. And I think what's interesting here is that we estimate that that's roughly 45% of all crime in England and Wales, which is a pretty significant chunk. Certainly causes alarm to some people, but that's what we reckon at the moment is our rough idea in terms of the level of crime. You'll be seeing this is a bit of a step model, so we're going down, unfortunately, to much smaller steps. The next figure, 876,000, that's the total number of cybercrime incidents. So if we to take out cybercrime from that figure on the left-hand side, we're left with just under 900,000 incidents. The figures are broadly similar year on year. They publish this survey every 3 months, and there's not a huge significant difference between the numbers over the last 12 months. Interestingly enough, if we look at businesses, there's very little data at the moment that we've got from official sources around business crime. We estimate around about 46% of businesses have suffered at least one cyber attack or breach within the past 12 months. And that's from a publication produced by the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sports with Ipsos Mori called the Cyber Breaches Survey. You can download it for free on the DCMS website. It's published normally every March, end of February, beginning of March, and well worth a read in terms of businesses' attitude towards cybercrime, and also includes some important elements there in relation to things like charities, voluntary organisations, and others as well. So if we're looking then at the next figure, 338,000, we go further down that step model, and these are the total number of fraud and cybercrime offences recorded by Action Fraud. So Action Fraud, as many of you will be aware, is the national or the central point for recording incidents of crime. It's the first place that we advise people to go to, but they are only recording 338,000 in that 12-month period. So from 4.5 million incidents down to 338,000. What that means is we're looking at a 7% reporting rate. So underreporting is a massive, massive issue that we're desperately trying to get on top of. And I've just pulled out a couple of statistics from Action Fraud data. The numbers are relatively low, so the fluctuations year on year will result in fairly significant changes in percentage. But we can see that the trend is certainly upwards. Increases in computer viruses and malware, and also in hacking, social media and email cases as well. So double-digit increases. And that's something that's being captured and reflected in some of those statistics that we're seeing coming out from Action Fraud. So then we go further down the line and we look at this number here, 26,000. And that's the total number of cybercrime incidents. So again, stripping out the fraud incidents from that, and we're really looking at just 3%, a 3% reporting rate for cybercrime, which is very, very low. And then my final figure, the number 65. Some of you probably would have worked out what this is. That is what we believe are the total number of convictions for cybercrime in England and Wales in the past 12 months. 65. You want to know what that looks like in percentage terms? It's a conviction rate of 0.007%, which is probably the lowest by a country mile compared to many other offences that the police are involved with. So we can see, just looking at that chart, the fact that there are a huge number of incidents on the left-hand side, but very, very few people, whether that's a business or an individual, then go on and report those incidents to the relevant authorities. And even when they are reported, it becomes very difficult to secure a conviction. And on my next slide, what I wanted to do is just try and explain some of the challenges that the law enforcement community faces in terms of dealing with cybercrime offenders and some of the legislation that we have to deal with as well. One thing I will just add on to this, which I think is quite an interesting aside, the number of convictions that you see there in terms of 65, we estimate that roughly around 1/3 of those are actually committed by police officers. And of course, that's not to say that police officers are master criminals who are committing cybercrime from their desks. It's just the fact that they may be officers who have inadvertently accessed the police national computer inappropriately. Because they're using a login and they're in a police station, it's a very, very easy case to try. And in many cases, that's where the convictions come from. So we estimate that we're looking around about 40 to 45 convictions in a 12-month period, which is incredibly low. And that is why most of the effort in terms of law enforcement is around education, awareness, and crime prevention. So in terms of some of the challenges that we face, I've got a list on the right-hand side you can see there, and I just wanted to say a few words on some of those to give you a bit more of a broader context. First of all, one of the biggest challenges we face is, of course, is the age of the offender. Research by Europol recently suggested that the average age of the cyber criminal is just 17 years old. Within the Police Digital Security Centre, we often hear cases where we've got 12 or 13-year-olds, and they've been involved in committing fairly serious offences, often learning how to hack websites from online videos. Many of them, of course, not realising what they are doing is wrong. Organised crime gangs know this as well and often recruit young people to help them commit their crimes on a mass scale. My colleague Neil will be talking shortly after me about some of the types of criminals that we see and how they approach their tradecraft. In any event, I think putting teenagers through the criminal justice system is far from ideal. We'd rather avoid it if we can. Certainly try and intervene with them at an earlier point and hopefully get them to use their skills in a far more productive and proactive way in helping us tackling more organised crime. Secondly, cybercrime really is a truly global problem, and it has no respect for traditional police force boundaries. We've got 43 police forces in England and Wales. Cybercrime often will hit not just one or two organisations, but several thousand anywhere in the country at any one time. Coordinating an effective law enforcement response is hard. It requires information sharing and collaboration across a number of organisations. Similarly, the sheer volume of cases means that only the most serious are likely to be investigated. As a consequence, the overwhelming majority of cybercrime falls under the radar. There's a broader point about victim care here, particularly for businesses suffering an attack or a breach, but the UK certainly isn't alone in facing this problem. Thirdly, the framework of the law around cybercrime creates its own challenges. For some time, commentators, including the Criminal Law Reform Now network, have suggested the Computer Misuse Act is outdated and doesn't reflect the current problems that we face. Legislation is always tricky to future-proof, even more so when it concerns technology. But we know that some countries are now seeking to address these issues through new laws. Evidential thresholds are another challenge. CPS guidance highlights some of the difficulties in obtaining sufficient evidence to secure a successful prosecution. Perhaps one of the biggest challenges is in relation to the law, of course, relates to offenders who are based overseas. Incredibly difficult, time-consuming, and expensive to bring offenders to justice if they're based outside the UK and even beyond the EU, including in the Far East. And finally, perhaps a challenge that affects everyone involved in cybersecurity concerns the huge skill shortage that the UK has in this particular area. Investigations are complex, require specialist skill sets. 10 years ago, relatively uncommon to have more than one phone. These days, of course, we probably own 5 or 6, maybe more, devices that are connected to the internet and have the capacity to store huge amounts of data. Analysis takes time and it eats up valuable resources. So where does the law enforcement focus its efforts? Well, traditional policing use a number of different models, but one of the ones that's been used recently, certainly around things like counter-terrorism, are what we call the 4 Ps. So we have prevent, prepare, protect, and pursue. Due to the complexities of bringing offenders to justice and investigating cybercrime, our focus shifts very much towards the first 3. And that's really about preventing businesses from becoming victims in the first place, preparing them for when a breach or an attack occurs, and working with businesses like F-Secure to help protect them from the most common types of cybercrime. Of course, there is no magic bullet. Policing will always pursue offenders, and rightly so, but we know that the most effective impact that we can have on tackling cybercrime is by focusing on those first 3 elements: prevent, prepare, and protect. And that brings me nicely to introduce my colleague Neil, who'll talk about the types of cyber criminals working against UK's businesses and how they are using social engineering to great effect, particularly since the lockdown. Over to you, Neil.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much. I am just bringing up my my screen here as we go. Thank you very much, Simon. There we are, I think. Okay, hopefully everybody. Okay, so we're going to be looking at the mind of the cyber criminal. I'm Neil Sinclair, Simon said, and I was introduced at the start. I'm the National Cyber Lead for the Police Digital Security Centre. I have a long-term background in counter-terrorism, working with police and various of the government agencies. And now, obviously, working with the Police Digital Security Centre, we predominantly work with small and medium-sized businesses. But the interesting thing is always who is out there, who is trying to break into our devices. Now, interestingly enough, we had both our previous speakers showed a picture of the hoodie wearing youth, which is probably how we still view the cyber criminal, not least because it's the way it's portrayed by the media in films and on TV. And it's a cliche, but there is an element of truth in it. The TalkTalk data breach of 2015 was carried out by teenagers. Whether they wore a hoodie or not is not known, but it's possible that the cliche does do more harm than good. What I want to talk through today is what is the reality of the cyber criminal, what type of person carries out these deeds, and what do we know about them. So obviously we have the Russian-sponsored Fancy Bear and hacking groups like Anonymous, and Anonymous being a particularly interesting one, as they've become slightly more mainstream, particularly during the period of the coronavirus. They've actually been talking with respected media and explaining how they work and what they're trying to do, and to some extent their involvement as almost opponents of some of the activities of things like Extinction Rebellion and things like that. The career cyber criminal who's out there trying to make money or just quite simply wreak havoc across various networks and for various businesses and what have you. These had been covered, the way they would mount the attacks and what have you. And I'm not particularly going to look into those. It's more of a case of exactly who these people are. The difficult thing, of course, is that we all have stereotypes in our minds. We can't help it. We try and train it out of us in all sorts of things. But the sort of areas that we would think of, the people who we are worried about are just like you and I. They are ordinary people. You could easily be sitting next to one of them in Starbucks, if you dare go to Starbucks currently. It could be the person who you sit across from in the office every day. It's, you know, there is no stereotype for it. There's the cyber criminals walk a fine line between just hacking for fun and serious crime. The WannaCry ransomware attack being a particular case in point, the alleged culprit was a young British man, Marcus Hutchins. And simply he identified a vulnerability in the systems and launched the attack into it. But he had performed other cyber crimes before it. Some young people are just quite simply interested in software code and computing, and they have the skill to hack into the networks and seem to find themselves quite simply having a go. If a person is curious about the darknet, they may find themselves exploring a world of leads them into unsavory company, an awful lot of that dark net, and it's just a case of avoiding going in through the popular browsers. Is where you'll find gun running, drug supply, even people trafficking, and you can very easily find yourself being drawn into it purely because it's so easy to do. But basically, the hoodie wearing, the youth, it's an overused cliche, and it does probably warp the public perception of what cybercrime is in reality. So we have the various types here, but the activist, or the hacktivist as we call him, so some would argue this type of cybercriminal, not really a criminal. He's following a reasonable code of ethics, or at least his code of ethics. And instead of crime for personal gain, they're targeting companies, organisations, governments who they believe are unethical. Often they'll use attacks like a distributed denial of service, popularly known as DDoS, simply to stop websites and services running. And the aforementioned Anonymous are a group such as this. Then we have the state actor, the nation state actor, a license to hack. They'll work with state sponsorship, and groups like the Russians' Fancy Bear have attacked the US political organisations, or at least they've been accused of doing so. And the Stuxnet, the cyber attack on Iranian power facilities, was linked to the US and Israeli governments. It may be interesting for you to know that whereas certain parts of GCHQ or NSA have a limited number of people down in Cheltenham, maybe some parts of it have as little as 6 or 7 people working on it. The States, maybe 150, but the Chinese would have 6,000 of their recruits there working on cyber state activism. We have the online stalker, of course, which is particularly topical and affects so many people in so many different ways of their life. And it's in fact caused the development of the National Stalking Advocacy Service, which estimates that around 5 million people experience stalking every year. A US survey by Harvard found that at least 20% of stalking cases do have a cyber element, either getting into emails or social media to learn more about and manipulate the target. Cyber terrorists, multiple opportunities for terrorism through the internet, as we will have seen over the last few years, particularly with the advent of ISIL. But it's not simply the things of blowing things up and killing people. It includes making money, laundering money, and just carrying out surveillance on targets. Money laundering is a massive part of cybercrime, and Europol has found that nearly 5% of global GDP is laundered every year. Much of this will be online criminal networks, but some will be down to cyber terrorist activities. Then there's the part-timer. It's so much easier to do. Obviously, it's you can rent stuff online. You can rent a malware. You can get phishing kits. That's a PH phishing kit, and it makes cyber criminality really easy to do from home. And of course, it's a really safe form of crime. You can sit at home in a bedsit. You can sit in a coffee shop and commit cyber crime and make an awful lot of money or upset a lot of people's lives. Whereas old-fashioned crime, robbery and things like that, there is always the chance, of course, that you'll get shot. So I know which one I would go for. Then, of course, the malicious insider. And this is the tricky one. They're fed up. they've been blackmailed perhaps because they've got financial issues or other issues, or they've been doing something that they shouldn't have been, that possibly partners shouldn't know about, or they're just being really helpful. And I'll go into this a little bit more because it's a really important facet of social engineering, is the human desire, generally speaking, to be helpful. And then, of course, there's the professional, the career cyber criminal, hardcore, makes a living, works at it full time. And we've seen a growth in this, particularly during the COVID crisis, because so many other areas of crime have found it really difficult because they couldn't go out unnoticed, for one thing, and to some extent they were frightened of dying from a virus. And so they've turned their attention to cybercrime, and the serious and organised crime gangs are now a part of the bigger picture. So various types there of cyber criminal, but I want to now turn our attention to what it actually looks like. And the big point of it is the social engineering. This is really the basis for every type of cyber crime. Even the malware attacks have an aspect of social engineering in them, because they look at the things that people will do, that people will be interested in opening or loading onto a system that enables the attack to take place. So it's often described as people hacking, convincing us to do things that we normally wouldn't do, that we know we shouldn't do. If I could see you all, I say, raise your hands if you haven't made a mistake at something this week. And of course we all have. And sometimes we've done it for the best of reasons. But the social engineer looks to build trust, offer a reward, and rely on human nature, and of course target the vulnerable. Again, something that we have really seen during the last 23, 24 weeks, of people being pressured into doing things out of fear, or because they can't access the things that they usually want to do. There is a list of the various types. Many of those you'll have heard many times. Phishing, pretexting, I'll explain that a little bit in a moment or two. Baiting, so getting somebody to do something by offering them a bait. Quid pro quo, I'll go into that a little bit more. Tailgating, which is much more a physical type of cybercrime, but one that we see every day, even walking through secure access in the workplace. Obviously not so much at the moment, but generally speaking, I'm sure we've all experienced that person who comes up behind you and says, "Oh, sorry, I've forgotten my pass," or offers to carry a heavy box for you or something so they can come through the gates with you. And of course, as the classic, if any of you have ever sat in a coffee shop and watched people go to the loo or go and order another drink and leave all their devices on the table, it would be very easy for somebody who had a mind to just to pop over and do something with that device. And then of course, sextortion. So many people, particularly again during the last 23 weeks, have combined doing their work with going onto porn sites. And of course, I make no exception here. The ladies are 15% of them are the users of these as well. And of course, people are getting found out, or they're being hit by the cyber criminal because it's something they know they shouldn't really be doing. Phishing, vishing, and smishing. So we have the ordinary phishing, and I'm sure we've all received plenty of these during the last 23 weeks. Phishing is with videos, and smishing, which is becoming so much more prevalent now, SMS, fraudulent SMS texts. And I think many of you, particularly if you're on O2 or EE, would have received one on Sunday saying that you had to click on a link on your phone to change some kind of security aspect. And it was a very sophisticated and widespread smishing attack. The terms there, you can read those in front of you. There's three types that we see. There's the spray and pray, the least sophisticated, mass sending of emails in the hope that some are opened. Now, often, of course, we laugh about these because we're all bright intellects and we're well educated and one thing another. So, well, who would fall for that email from the Nigerian prince saying that there's £1 million waiting for you if you just send them 5,000? because it's full of spelling mistakes and bad grammar and one thing and another. Well, the secret here is that they play on people's avarice and people's tendency to want to do the right thing, as I mentioned before. And they don't want the likes of us engaging with them and getting them involved in a back and forward and asking them to send proof and what have you. They want that person who will just click through it and just go for it straight away. If they send out 1,000, they want 5 replies at the most, because that's all they can deal with. And so they're wanting to turn away the people who think about it a little bit more deeply. Spear phishing, targeting individuals, and we've seen these, a trusted supplier or customer who seeks you to do something, and the whaling, targeted at board level, hackers using open sources. And LinkedIn is a massive problem in this area, because it's there for us to big ourselves up, to say how good we are, how long we've been with a company, how important we are, how many people work for us. And for the cyber criminal, it's something very easy for them to trawl through, and they can find out who is the CEO of Police Crime Prevention Initiatives, who is the financial officer, who is the PA, who is the last person in through the door, and mount their attack very cleverly using those different levels of people. Pretexting, and this combines with a bit of quid pro quo here. I'll let you read this as I run through it, but it's the clever thing of somebody contacting someone, having done their homework, they've seen a bit of a press release, they found out a bit about the company, and they use something that they've seen to try and convince the recipient that they are legitimate. So this one, lead system engineer from ABC Services, they know somebody else in the company, works in IT, Brian, just spoken to him, he said that we've got to do this urgently. And I know by looking at LinkedIn that you've worked in the company for many years, you've done many jobs, and you're the best person for me to contact, because you'll be able to get this out really quickly and the boss will be really pleased with you. So it's playing on your ego to do the right thing. And of course, because they've said they've spoken to all these people before, you're not going to pick up the phone and go back and ask them, are you? Well, yes, you should really. And it's one of the really important things around cybercrime, is to remember that you can actually talk to people physically as opposed to just using the internet. I need to send this patch out to all the staff. And of course, because it's going to stop all the guys working all night, you do it. And so the attack is launched. It's a clever combination. A lot of research has gone into it, and it's very specific. Baiting, again, become very prevalent during lockdown particularly, but we see so much of it on sites like Facebook. Very similar to a phishing attack, but what distinguishes them is the promise of an item or good that will entice you to do something. So in this case, we've got a CD by Madonna, but it could be flights, it could be the free iPad. I'm sure we've all seen those. If you're on Facebook, you have 5 minutes to win a free iPad. It pays on the urgency, something that you'd like, and of course it's based on algorithms and what have you, but they leverage an offer of something, so it becomes far more physical. But the whole thing that they want is for you to reveal your login credentials or your financial credentials. And it's not just the online schemes, they focus on exploiting human curiosity. So they might say, well, you know, here's a USB stick free for you, and you stick it in the machine and you launch loads of malwares and what have you. Tailgating or piggybacking, when I mentioned this in my intro, and there you can see the examples. The physical forcing your way through secure doors. And I have to say that I do this all the time when I go and visit businesses, and I buzz through and I say it's Kevin Costner and I'm here to see the CEO. And nobody ever questions whether it's Kevin Costner or not, because it's a name they recognise, and they've got far more important things to do than to check who's standing at the door. And you can walk in and then do whatever you want. And the borrowing of a laptop for a few minutes, of course, not so much when you're working from home, although there is the danger that if you leave your laptop open and your 14-year-old child decides they want to go and do something or mess something up for you, they could quite easily do it. So it brings this all a little bit closer to home when you're working at home and you're doing work there with people with people who don't necessarily have the same thought processes as yourself about security and about what you're doing. Sextortion, again, thousands of people all over the world have been receiving these emails. You may have received one yourself. And what has happened is usually your email address and an old password often have been trawled through the dark web, have been found there and picked up by the scammers. And they'll send an email saying, hello, Neil, we have found your username of da-da-da, and we have found your password, and it'll be an old-fashioned one, usually 8 digits or alphanumeric. And we have seen that you have been sending pictures or have been looking at this, that, and the other. If you don't pay us a certain amount of Bitcoin, we will tell all your friends and family because, of course, we have access to your contacts. And people panic and just pay it without really thinking, even sometimes thinking, well, I actually have never sent photos of myself, but I have been on these sites or what have you. Very successful and very scary. And of course, it can ruin people's lives. We've seen a few more themes during COVID-19, distributed malware. And of course, with people behaving differently, cyber criminals have very quickly picked up on what people are doing, where people's sensitivities are, where people's fears are. These 5 types of attack that I mentioned here, and I'll show you an example of each, have played particularly on the COVID-19 virus. So the Ave Maria, disposable face masks and forehead thermometers. Who at the start of April was not interested in getting something like this? Well, of course, we all were. And these emails would come through and you'd know that you'd never asked for this and there was no real reason for getting it. But weren't you interested to know, particularly when the NHS was saying that they couldn't get hold of these things? And there you are being offered a whole lot of them. And you click on the link and, of course, that would download the malware onto your system. And if these were sent and opened by NHS trusts and care homes and what have you, you can imagine the damage that ran through that. The Netwired RC, this one from UNICEF, and it's also, of course, you know, everybody wants more information or wanted more information at the time, how it was being dealt with, what the long-term prognosis was and all that sort of stuff. And again, telling you how to protect yourself and staff from the current daily virus. Click on the link, launch a malware across the system. But who would look, you know, UNICEF, the clue is in the email address at the top there. But seeing that with the logo on it, people were desperate for information and they would click through very quickly. Lockybot, priority order, Estonia, MN Medicals. Well, it could even be that HMG fell for something like this when they sent their order off to Turkey, only to find out that Turkey hadn't got anything to send back. Similar sort of thing. COVID supplies, who didn't want them? We await your soonest response. A typical line to have in there, a sense of urgency, priority request, this, that, and the other. So very tempting. Ventilators requirement, well, around the time of when Dyson was or was not doing ventilators, and we all knew how important the ventilators were becoming, particularly after Boris had been in hospital. And so this sort of attack, again, playing on what people were looking at the time. So you see it, the social engineering around it, knowing what people are like, knowing what people want to do, and just people's inquisitiveness. And of course, if you clicked on the Excel spreadsheet there and you've got macros enabled, then the whole system could possibly fall like a house of cards through that one. And the final one is Danabot. Again, this was incredibly specific because if people out there were interested in all this sort of stuff about how it was spreading, which countries were going up, which were going down, how was Britain doing as we rocketed towards 40,000 deaths. This one got into the John Hopkins, or purported to be the John Hopkins weekly review or even bi-weekly review. And this one was sent to people, and of course Johns Hopkins was all over the media. But you click on some of the information in here and this would launch the malware into the system. But again, playing on what we were doing at the time, very clever, very difficult to spot the reality behind it. And many, many people and businesses fell foul of this. Another interesting one, somebody today earlier said, how old are you if you're talking about Tupperware? But during the coronavirus, when everybody was hoarding things, of course, it became an issue of how do we store what we're making. Those of you who couldn't find flour for weeks on end, it's because people were baking things. And to store things, they went to Tupperware. Now, this one is a really clever one, because what it did was a front that you would click into. So people said they were selling Tupperware. You would go to it, good prices, click on the form, do your order, and then get to the payment page and put in your details. Having put in your details, the form would time out. And then it would reopen on the proper Tupperware pages. So you'd still get your order and you'd still receive your Tupperware in 3 or 4 days' time. But ahead of that, the criminals had stolen all your payment details because you had put them into the rogue iframe. Very clever, taking you into the site immediately afterwards. And who hasn't been timed out? Many times. So again, playing on what people are used to and exploiting something that was happening at the time. Very clever, very personalized, and really, really difficult. You see there the web address at the top. Where was the flag that this was a criminal enterprise? So the simple solutions: passwords, using a phrase, make sure the computer generates it. Don't try and do it yourself, because you'll almost certainly come up with one that are easily cracked. Humans are just very poor at doing this sort of thing. If I was to ask all you listeners to think of a vegetable, the majority of you would say carrot. And that's just how it works. It's what we do. Password one, QWERTY keyboard, all those things. We think we're so clever, and so does everybody else. The good ones are in green there. If they're strong enough, you don't have to change them very often. And I'm sure you know the advice. Pick 3 random things, link them together if you're sitting at your desk. So it might be light glass football. Makes it just that little bit more difficult, and adding in those dashes and things like that. And of course, ultimately use a password manager. NCSC recommends it. You should do it. There are many good ones out there. Some are free, some aren't. Dashlane and 1Password are highly recommended for Android and Apple, but there are others out there. Control access and user privileges. Now, these two things, the passwords and this, key parts of Cyber Essentials: control access and user privileges. I've mentioned being at home, and of course, how many people have an admin account on their home computer? Very few, if any, I would wager. But it's really important that the things that are done to the network, the changes that are made in the network, are restricted to a person who has the need to do that. Don't let everybody else in. Keep them minimal. Is really important. Train the team regularly and onboard them and offboard them. Make sure they know the stuff when they come in, and make sure you take the stuff away from them when they leave. Otherwise, you'll have somebody out there using your company email and the company password to go into whatever it is, porn sites, other criminal activities. Stay safe, stay alert, and think before you click. Thank you very much indeed. That's the end of me. And now to our next, please.
Thanks, Neil. So over to you then, Anthony.
Okay. Share my screen. Screen sharing okay? If you can just confirm that, that would be great.
No, I've just got, can't see it as of yet, no.
I've clicked on share. No?
No, I've just got the Zoom screen at the moment.
I've clicked on share. showing the square thing around my screen. So what is going on? All right, let me do that again. I picked it and I've shared it. Yeah.
Yep, we're in business.
We're
Thanks, Anthony.
in business. That is good to hear. Okay, so you can see my slide there, yeah?
Yep.
Great stuff. Okay. Right. So name is Anthony. So in this section, I want to talk to you about how to map your attack surface and also how to derive maximum value and ROI from your investments. But before we go into the details of that, I would like to cover where we stand today. What is it that the enterprise are not getting right, and just look for where the common problems might be. So if we look at this data here, so this shows us the last few data breaches in the last couple of years. So when you look at the details, you start to see some common denominators, right? A lot of these companies, I've worked with some of them, so I know some of the technologies that they've deployed. So a lot of them deploy a Magic Quadrant leading solution, so the best of the best, and yet we get this disaster here, right? So if we look at British Airways, for instance, so the payment system, whereby they take payments from customers, was not being secured properly, right? Or if we look at Marriott Hotel, so they had files being encrypted, which is what you should do, sensitive files being encrypted. However, the encryption key was on the same server, right? Or things like Equifax, where they forgot to patch a critical server, okay? Or if we look at the likes of perhaps you might have heard about the Intel data breach, which was fairly recent, where a simple Nmap scan discovered an internet-facing service. So on that service, we had a server whereby we had sensitive data, things like chip roadmaps and a lot of other sensitive data. So the point there being is the technology was not a problem. The technology is there. It is actually human error that we need to deal with. And also planning security properly, taking security seriously, really. Now, if we look at, to verify that data from Verizon, so they had a report out recently. And here you can see, once again, the data is there. Errors caused by people, 22%, right? So if you take that figure and add it to the social attacks and one of the figures here, suddenly the people component, so people become the weakest link here. So that needs to be addressed properly. So all in all, what we're saying is we really need to go back to the drawing board. We need to take security seriously. So if we hear some of the stuff that the speakers spoke about earlier, Christine, Simon, and Neil. So what they're really trying to tell us is the bad actors, they're skilled, they have the right motivations, right? So we're hearing about backdoors coming through spam. We're hearing about, so Simon mentioned, I think 6.4 billion fake emails every day. These are serious situations. So when we go about investing in technology, we absolutely need to have other conversations, right? So I see that behavior in a lot of my customers. When I get calls, they want me to talk about how great my EDR tool is. So I try to say, okay, yes, we have that solution and it can do a lot of stuff for you, but let us talk about the process in which you want to embed that technology, because otherwise there is no way you can achieve your objectives. And I'll just give you another very specific example from another customer. This customer bought our vulnerability manager, so it scans the network for vulnerabilities. And they sent me all kinds of dashboards showing all kinds of alerts. So it was quite verbose. So their problem was, F-Secure, your tool, tells me there's a lot of problems, but I have no idea what to do with the data. So my first question was, well, what were your objectives when you bought the solution? So the response was, well, we needed some form of network-wide threat predictability, which was just a fancy way of saying, I need to understand my level of exposure to these things, right? So they had some form of objectives in place, which was great. My next question was, can you show me your risk assessment documents? And of course, they had none. Now, that document should inform what type of risk treatment plan that you will require. And naturally, that a treatment plan will determine what kinds of processes they need to put in place. And of course, the technology can embed into those processes. And of course, people will have a bit more clarity as to how to deal with the data, right? So it's absolutely critical to go through that process, okay? Now, when it comes to also defining those security objectives, it's again, we're talking about security. So it is absolutely critical that we understand what our enemies or what the bad actors are doing. We need to understand the key activities, right? So I'm sure you guys might have heard about the kill chain from Lockheed Martin, or the Mata attack framework. So they talk about the TTPs. So we need to understand the TTPs before we invest in any form of technology. So at the beginning there, you see the recon phase. This is where the threat actors, they try to understand your organizations. They try to understand who you are. And of course, if there are any public-facing assets that they can scan and start to formulate some type of attack plan. So at this phase already, there's some very simple things you can do. So first of all, you can just, hire a pen tester if you can afford one, or you can use some very simple tools that can give you an understanding of what you look like to the internet. So things like active services or open ports, and also the discovery of shadow IT. And so for instance, maybe you ran a marketing campaign. So typically a lot of organizations that might spin up a new virtual environment to host that for a specific time frame, but then IT forgets to take down that server once the campaign is completed. So that might represent a bit of a problem. So when you do that pen test, or you run a check yourselves, you might discover these components and then act upon it as soon as possible. So after the recon phase, you might have an attacker who has certain data about yourselves. They might start to craft some kind of weaponized payload and then deliver that via all this delivery vectors. So we heard again from Christine how that works. We also understand that quite a lot of the data breaches happen via the email vector. So it makes, of course, sense when we're investing, when we're talking about security, that we need to consider that, right? So Simon mentioned 6.4 billion fake emails are going through. So let us invest in a good email security platform. But I will say that is not enough. So we also need to look at what happens below that layer. So what happens when stuff gets through the email security solution, which we know it does fairly often. So this is where we need to make sure we invest in what I would say an intelligent, layered endpoint security solution. So layered meaning that it understands Webflow, it understands applications and anomalies, and it understands how processes might be spun up, and it understands the communications between different processes. So if one process is trying to reach out to another space from another application, it might flag that to the administrator. So moving on from that, you have the exploit phase. So this is where the attackers now looking for your vulnerable applications, vulnerable operating systems. So it makes sense to invest in something like patch management. Make sure that your systems are patched up in a timely manner. And of course, things like access control might play a role here when you look at file and location access and that sort of thing. All right. And then moving on from that, you might start to witness things like lateral movement. And this is where things get slightly tricky. Now, a lot of organizations that I deal with, they tend to think that just dealing with simple anti-malware can actually help them for all this stuff. But then if you think about it, anti-malware, we're talking about signatures. So it might make sense for the delivery phase and to some degree at the exploit phase, but then that's where it really stops. So this is where we now need to look at intelligent solutions, right? So we know that these attackers, they try to remain under the radar and live off the land by utilizing valid authenticated applications, right? So here we need a tool that has the intelligence to see that, okay, yes, this is a valid application, but I can see that it's being used in an either in an unauthorized fashion, or we highlight certain activities as an anomaly. So this is the domains of things like EDR, and again, you know, access control might make sense at this stage as well. And then last but not least, the attacker might gain access to your sensitive data. So this is where you might be looking at things like, again, EDR plays a lot of value at this space. Again, access control, along with the layered EPP, might play a bit of a role here as well. Application control, but also DLP. So with DLP, if I can categorize my data, so sensitive data is being categorized and tagged appropriately, so you can start to wrap around some security controls around that. So you can encrypt your sensitive data, and you can write rules like, okay, if it's classified as sensitive, it cannot leave your organization unless it is encrypted. And also you can regulate who has access to those files, plus determine the location where those that have access, where they can send that data to as well. Okay. So when we look at all of this stuff, it becomes important to be able to connect the dots, right? So how do I discover, or how do I understand what was the point of entry of a particular attack? How did it try to move across the organization? So all that conversation is not something that everybody can do. Not the usual IT or system administrator have that kind of skill set. So this is where we need to revisit that conversation around people. So it's important to make sure the low-level alerts, yes, your service desk or IT or sysadmin, they might be able to look at that. But then you need somebody, you need a security expert that understands these types of activities to make the right interpretations. Because when you have EDR and all the other tools and perhaps a SIM solution, there's a lot of data to digest. And if you're under attack, time becomes a factor. So we need somebody to make the right interpretations fairly quickly. As we can see on the screen there, so we have a DLL hijacking a situation there. And then, you know, the expert can come in and say things like, okay, this might be a potential privilege escalation detection. So this is what we're going to do about it. Okay. So just loop back to this diagram here. It is absolutely critical that we understand this. But again, so based on the data that we saw earlier, the data from Verizon and whatnot, right? So it is clear that the people component is something that needs special attention. So we need to look at ourselves, or the enterprise space need to look at the people they hire. We know there's a shortage of skills out there. So don't just stop at that. If you feel you might not have people who understands the complexities here, please do extend your team to the likes of Flow Communications, and hopefully we can all work together and make sure that your security objectives are being well met, because we can help you build out a proper framework or process, and then help you embed technology into your frameworks. And with that, I thank you very much.
Thanks, Anthony. I'll just take the screen share back from you. Thanks a lot. So I appreciate we've gone over the hour slightly here. So thank you everyone that stayed on the call. I'll just briefly touch on the last point here, who to call if you were to have a security breach. Now, there's a number of sort of reputable organizations out there that offer good guidelines on how to deal with a security breach. Some of them are the National Cybersecurity Center, to name one. Because I'm doing screen share, you can't actually click on these. So what I've done is I've put QR codes on all of these links, which will stay on the screen during the Q&A session. So if you wanted to scan these on your phone, then that will redirect you to these web pages, like the NIST web page, where you can download this documentation here, which gives you guidance on how to deal with a security breach. Along with SANS, I'm sure you've all heard of SANS and the SANS Top 20, and of course, CREST. One thing I will add is, with regards to all of these guidelines, it's a bit like, it's good to be prepared, but it's a lot like, fixing the brakes on your own car. You could fix your own brakes if you wanted to, but have you got the time? Have you got the tools to do the job? Will it be safe afterwards? And in reality, would you be better off just paying someone to do it for you, or at the very least, having a friend you can call upon that will give you some guidance and make things a lot easier for you? And that's basically Flow Communications. So I didn't want to turn this into a sales pitch, so I won't go into our products and services around that now. But if you'd like to find out more information on how Flow or F-Secure can help you protect yourself from a cyber breach or deal with a cyber breach, then feel free to reach out to either myself or anyone you might be speaking to at Flow. And then we'll just do the Q&A session now. So we had some questions come in, which I'll just read out to the panel when I get them. So the first one came in when you were speaking, Neil, so you might be best poised to answer this. So I'll just read it. It says, cybersecurity threats are becoming a significant threat. Nevertheless, during a pandemic, companies are not only prepared to invest more into cybersecurity, but often make difficult decisions to make their IT staff redundant. When the economy sees recovery, then demand for cybersecurity skills will be even higher. How are we going to enforce organizations to start treating cybersecurity seriously? This is not going to happen overnight. So I guess that, it's quite an open question. Anyone could feel free to answer that. As I say, it came in when you were speaking, Neil, so it's up to you if you want to have a stab at it.
I'll have the first stab, Lewis. Thank you very much. Thanks, Martin, for that question. I don't think we'll ever enforce it, to use your words. I think that would be a step too far for any government to litigate on that. So enforcement is always going to be off the radar, I believe. But the important thing is that we make it something that's cultural. And I sense that because people have been at home and more concerned about cybersecurity on their home networks, as well as just the work ones, it will have a positive effect on the workplace when we go back. We usually take our best things from home to work rather than the other way around often. And of course, the problem for all businesses is that the difficulty is that everybody feels that the attack it's a when it happens, not an if. So businesses often feel loath to spend money on the front line. They want something that's simple and efficient. So I think making sure the businesses, the employees have specific work devices to cut down that crossover between work and home is a really important one. Initially expensive, but long-term hugely beneficial. And then putting perimeter security around that remote workforce network. You know, the stuff that's in the cloud, that's great, but you need a perimeter security around it. And I think that's the important thing. I think the other thing we have to remember is 75% of businesses are just a one-person business. Now they do touch the wider supply chain, but you know, I think it's really difficult. It'd be really hard for Waitrose, I think, to say that they weren't going to take some kind of product just because the person wasn't cyber secure. That's Neil out.
Thanks, Neil. Let me see if I've got another question here. Yes, Bill, the slides can be mailed out, and we've recorded the webinar, which will probably be posted on YouTube as well. So you can share that with any of your colleagues or friends that might be interested. And those are the only two questions we had. So I'll just wait a few seconds just to see if anyone else asks anything. And if not, then we'll sign off, I guess. Oh, Bill's got another one. 2 seconds in. If you like, Bill, I can unmute you if you wanted to speak. Bill asks, how do you think Brexit will affect your ability to police this?
Simon.
Yeah, I was just unmuting myself. That's a really good question. I think one of the biggest challenges that we have with Brexit is around information sharing. Reading the news recently and observing what's happening, I think the absence of a deal at the end of this year means that there may well be some challenges in terms of how we share intelligence and information about cybercrime with other countries, not just within the EU, but possibly beyond, where we've been previously utilising the networks that the EU has and the relationships with other law enforcement bodies. You know, one hopes that might only be a short-term measure until something can be signed and agreed, but potentially it does create a difficulty for us.
Thanks, Simon. Hopefully that answered your question, Bill. I'll just wait a few seconds to see if we get another one typed in. And if anyone wants to ask a question live, then just raise your hand or message me and I can unmute you if you prefer. So I think that might be it for questions, everyone. Hopefully no one's typing anything out at the moment. So yeah, so I think that's it. So thank you everyone for jumping on the webinar. Thank you to the panel for speaking on the webinar. I'll be sending out a feedback email over the course of the next few days. So anyone that's listened in, it would be greatly appreciated if you could fill that out. It would just be, you know, tick a few boxes like, did you find it interesting or informative? You know, 1 to 10, something like that. So it shouldn't take very long. So yeah, thanks again, everyone. And that's it from us. Thanks a lot.